firms that should be competing with one another. But just as often, it's important for the government to try to promote collaboration or collusion between people who need to cooperate with one another and who, in the absence of cooperation, would not achieve beneficial social goals, right? And that's exactly what we're going to try to talk about today. Public projects which require individuals to cooperate in order for them to succeed. Basically because they have diffuse benefits or costs which are spread out over society, and therefore voluntary initiative is unlikely to be able to achieve the goal because individuals will be unwilling to bear the diffusely spread out costs in order to achieve the social benefit associated. So we'll start by talking about Cournot's model of collaboration, which will link up very closely with what we've been studying in the last couple of classes, and which is sort of the simplest model of this type of a situation, and relate it to Cournot competition, and from that derive a corollary to Cournot's theorem, but which is going to be much more pessimistic, which is going to be that as the number of people gets large, you won't be able to achieve anything in a collaborative environment. We'll then talk about the relationship of these ideas to public goods and bads, and then talk about why private solutions to these problems usually won't work, as well as how coercion is in practice and should be used to deal with these types of problems. In particular, we'll focus on the case of assembling complementary goods as is done in land assembly or eminent domain. And then we'll talk about how, once we're going to use coercion, we as a society can make a decisions about how to use the coercion, and those social choices will be the last thing we end on, and then I'll give a really brief wrap-up of the course. Okay, so Cournot was a pretty smart guy. He came up with a monopoly model. He came up with a competition model that we talked about. And he also came up with this very important model of what he called collaboration, or in French, concours. So in this model, there's n firms, but rather than producing perfectly substitutable goods, they produce perfectly complementary goods. So that means that consumers need to have all of the goods in order to get any utility. And therefore, the consumer's demand depends not on just like the price for any individual good, but on the sum of all the prices, right? Because they have to purchase all the goods in order for it to be worth it for them to purchase any of them. So the quantity that they purchase is a decreasing function of capital P, which is the sum of all the individual little PIs, which are the prices charged for each of the goods. And for simplicity, again, we're going to assume that each firm has a constant marginal cost, CI. Profits are then PI minus CI times the quantity, which depends on the sum of everyone's prices. Right? Another way to write that is that each firm's profit is its markup times the quantity, which depends, sorry, this should be a plus here, which depends on the markup plus the cost. The total markup of all the firms plus the total of all firms' costs. Right? Because the total price, each individual price is just the cost plus the markup. So the total price is just the sum of all the markups plus the sum of all the costs. Sorry, again, it should be a plus. So as usual, all the capital letters are just the sums over all firms of the small letters. And notice that this is very similar to something else that we were looking at a couple of lectures ago. And I don't think Andy's here, is he? Does anyone want to try to relate this thing that the firm's trying to maximize to something else that we discussed a few lectures ago? Any ideas? Well, so notice that what everyone is doing in this case is they're all taking the prices of everyone else's given. So they're each going to try to maximize their profits, taking as given the prices charged by all the other firms. Right? And the quantity that they sell depends on the sum of all the prices. And profits are determined by the product of the price that they charge, price or markup that they charge, and quantity. Okay, so in some sense that's exactly the same as the Cournot model we were talking about before, right? Because in the Cournot model, everyone takes the quantities of all of their firms as given. The price that they get depends on the sum of all the quantities. And the profits that they make are the product of those quantities and the price. Right? And so if you just switch the word markup or price for the word quantity, this is exactly the same as the Cournot model. Right? And so this model is exactly what's called dual to, or equivalent to, the Cournot model of competition. Except that the relevant choices are made about the prices rather than about the quantities. Does that make sense? Okay, so then what we can do is any result that we got in the Cournot model, we can apply here, just interchanging prices and prices or markups for quantities. So, however, notice that in the Cournot model we would say things like, well, the quantities get small. Here we'd have to say the markups get small, or that the price goes to what's efficient. Here, in other words, the firms make no profits. Here, the quantities are going to have to go to zero in those same circumstances. So every result that we got there is going to be reversed here. So as the number of firms grow, rather than getting lower and lower prices, we're going to have to get higher and higher prices and lower quantities. This is sometimes called the double marginalization problem. The basic problem is that each firm, when it raises its price, reduces the quantity that all the other firms in the industry sell. Not just the amount that it sells, right? Because no one wants to buy the left shoe if they can't purchase the right shoe, right? So when the price of the right shoe goes up, the quantity purchased of the left shoe goes down. And that means that each firm sort of piles its own markup on top of the costs of producing the good. And because they don't take into account the harm that this has on other firms, they're each sort of scrambling for their little part of the pie, even though they're reducing the overall size. So as each tries to get a piece of the total profits and crowd the other people out of getting a piece of the profits, they're going to drive down the profits made by all the other firms. So actually, if all the firms were to merge together, they would actually lower prices, not raise them. Right? Because they would then internalize the fact that if they raise their price, that harms another person who's producing a complementary good. So what this means is that we should have very different policy approaches towards vertical mergers. What's a vertical merger? Well, if like a coal company produces coal that they then sell to a steel company, which then turns it into steel to sell to consumers, mergers between the coal company and the steel company are going to be potentially beneficial, even if there are no efficiencies. Whereas a merger between two competing companies will typically be harmful, as we discussed in the last lecture. Another example would be a patent pool. So if there are a bunch of different complementary technologies, like the technology to make a case for the cell phone, and a technology to make the cell phone, or the technology to make a SIM card for the cell phone, and the technology for the device, a merger between those companies will actually lead to lower prices because they won't each be trying to grab a bigger chunk of the total profits driving up the total value, right? Okay. So vertical mergers, mergers between complementary goods, give exactly the opposite result of mergers between substitutable goods. And Vic, what do you think the reverse of Cournot's theorem in this context would be?
The prices will go down as there's more firms.
Well, that was Cournot's theorem, right? But here, everything is exactly reversed from Cournot's theorem, right?
And then the prices will go up.
Yeah, so Cournot said that as the number gets very large, we get towards perfect efficiency. What do you think, what's the opposite of that here? What would be the exact opposite result?
Are you saying that with vertical mergers?
No, so Cournot's theorem was about as the number of competing firms gets large, prices go down to cost, and we get an efficient quantity.
Yeah.
What will happen as the number of complementary firms gets large?
Oh, then prices will go up because then there's so much. They'll go up because then they're all competing. Like you just said up here with more firms.
And what would be the really extreme outcome? So if the extreme outcome,
nothing produced.
Nothing produced. Yeah, the whole market shuts down. So that's called Bergstrom's. So each, as the number of firms goes large, just as the markup went to zero before, now the quantity produced is going to go to zero, right? So each firm's markup individually becomes small. Collectively, there's so many firms producing so many markups that the price goes to infinity, or to the point where there's no demand. And so we just get these layers and layers of monopoly. So this is sometimes called Bergstrom's corollary to Cournot's theorem. It's also called the tragedy of the commons, or the collective action problem. And it's sort of the key thing we'll focus on today. Throughout the course we talked about this idea that if people only have a diffuse interest in something, they'll tend to fail to achieve their collective goals. And that's exactly what's going on here. If there's a bunch of different people, all of whom have an interest in a low price, but each of whom individually would like to grab a bigger part for themselves, everyone will end up eating alive the industry and eventually destroying it. Yeah, there you go.
This is kind of a dumb question, but when you say n firms, you mean that there's n complements?
And perfectly complementary.
So to get one, you have to get all of them.
Yes, exactly. So as they become more and more, as it becomes more fragmented into more and more complementary pieces, the market falls apart. Okay, so let's consider a very similar but even more famous problem, which is basically the one we saw in problem set 3. So imagine you can make a costly contribution to a charity in an amount AI, right? And each person gets some value, VI, which depends only on the total contribution that everyone makes, not on the particular contribution that they make. And let's assume that everybody prefers there to be more contributions to the charity. So then each person's individual value is VI of capital A minus AI, whereas the value to society is capital V of A, which is the sum of all the individual values. So any individual making a contribution brings a total social value, capital V prime, but brings a value to each individual of only VI prime, right? So one example of this would be if everyone was symmetric, then the social optimum would be that V prime over N. Sorry, the private optimum would be that V prime over N is equal to 1, but the social optimum would be V prime is equal to 1. So, graphically, if V prime is like this, there's declining marginal utility. V prime being equal to n, if n was large, would be like sorry, this is oh yeah, V prime being equal to n would give you this point over here, a very low quantity, but V prime being equal to 1 would give you down here, which would be a very high quantity, right? And as n gets larger, this is going to go further and further up, and you're going to get fewer and fewer contributions being made, right? Because each person only gets 1/n of the total value to society, right? And so this is exactly the same result as we just described. The problem is, each person, if they reduce their price, gets the full reduction in price, but only a small part of the value of the increase in quantity, right? Similarly to here, everyone who contributes to charity gets the full cost of having to pay for the charity, but only a tiny part of the social benefit associated with that, right? So everybody is going to free ride and hope that other people make the costly contributions which benefit them. Right?
So why do people donate to charity?
Well, we'll talk about that in a moment. But, so this is called the collective action problem. So in a large population with voluntary contribution, quote-unquote public goods are going to become arbitrarily underprovided. That is, the gap between what's socially efficient and what's an equilibrium is going to become arbitrarily large. Okay, but what exactly is it that makes something a quote-unquote public good in the sense that I just described it? Edward? What's the definition of a public good?
I mean, it's like something that like everybody can enjoy without like competing with each other.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So there were two parts of what Edward said. One was without competing with each other, and the other was everybody can enjoy. And I just want to break those into two parts. The first one is that everybody can enjoy it. Right? Or sorry, that they don't compete with one another. And this is the biggest part. So this is called being non-rival. That means one person receiving the benefit does not preclude other people from receiving that benefit. That is, there's zero marginal cost of supplying to additional people. The second is that everybody can enjoy it, that there's no way to keep anyone from enjoying it. That's called being non-excludable. And that's of secondary importance, but it's still important. So everyone receives the benefit regardless of what they do. They don't have to pay anything, they can always access it. So examples that fail the first condition, that are somewhat rival but are non-excludable, are called congestible public goods. So you can't keep people out, but still it's harmful to have too many people there. The second, things that are that fail the second condition, which are non-rival but you can't exclude people from, are called excludable public goods. Intellectual property is an example of this, potentially at least, if it's possible to keep people from using the products which you have a patent on, right? Because there's no additional cost of distributing music more broadly, but it may be possible to keep people who don't pay from using the music. So this is really more of an issue of the cost of excluding people. For almost any product, if you spend enough money, you could exclude people, right? But it may be so costly to do that that it's not worth it. And music seems to be moving from the realm of being sort of an excludable public good to being a pure public good recently, because it's becoming so hard to stop people from stealing music, right? So At least as important, I think, in the definition of a public good, even though these are the traditional criteria, is whether the individual person in the population knows the value that they place on the product better than any social or business authority would. So one thing that defined the intellectual property that we talked about is that there was some entrepreneur who had a great idea, who was going to create a product that he thought everyone was going to love. You know, Steve Jobs created the iPhone, he thought everyone was going to love it, and even if they didn't love it initially, he had the confidence that eventually they were going to come around to it. Usually public goods are going to be things where, like, at the moment that we're thinking about creating them, members of the population have a much better sense, at least potentially, of how much they value them than any individual person would. So they're public not just in the sense of how they can be used, but also in terms of who knows about the value associated. Okay, so Michael, what are some examples of a pure public good? Look up.
Not none. Like, park.
Okay, so let's think about that. Is it non-rival? Can a park get too crowded? I think it probably can, right? I mean, a giant park might be non-rival.
So could we say like the air?
Yeah, I think the air is pretty close. Like air quality, that's pretty close to a pure public good. Does anyone else have any other ideas? Yes, Steve.
National defense.
Yeah, national defense is a good example. That's sort of, you know, you enjoying your national defense doesn't really stop anyone else in the country from enjoying it.
The ocean.
Yeah, environmental services, right? Like weather, right? Like it being warm for one person doesn't really change whether it's warm for somebody else. The existence value of some goods, like a culture or an environmental service, you know, just the benefit of living in a humane society, like which a lot of charities help bring, right? So, and just straight up ideas, right? Stuff that's not even intellectual property, just like an idea or a fact or something, that's almost impossible to keep from spreading, right? The Nazis certainly tried. Yeah, Ben.
Well, I thought charities would be like excludable because like you have congestion.
Well, I
Like,
don't.
You could only allocate.
Not in terms of enjoying the benefit of them. So I mean, I agree. Charities sort of bring two types of benefits, right? One type of benefit that a charity brings is like if it gives money directly to some poor person, that poor person directly benefits. But charities also give a benefit indirectly to the rest of the population because they don't like to see people be impoverished, right? And that sort of a benefit is neither excludable nor rival, right?
Because everyone else benefits
Yeah.
from one person.
Exactly.
So you could also say like the national weather. I don't know, wherever like don't like all weather channels get their like weather data from one national.
Yeah, that's a good example. So like that's sort of a classic example of sort of ideas or facts or scientific progress. Those sorts of things are like not rival. They're almost impossible to exclude people from, right? Okay. What about congestible public goods, Jace? What are some examples of public goods that are congestible?
Like you're saying, parks.
Yeah. Any other ideas? Things that the government provides that are sort of public goods but are congestible.
Public roads.
Yeah. Public infrastructure generally is a great example of congestible stuff. So like roads and bridges are very congestible. Amenities like lakes, parks, national parks or city parks. And how about excludable public goods, Anthony? What are some examples of goods that are not rival but can easily be excluded?
Well, excludable goods would be like software and stuff.
Yeah. Those are pretty easy to track whether someone's using them or not, right? Because we have good technologies for doing that. But they're totally non-rival because they can be copied for free, right? Another example of this might be So land reform, when you have like a big hacienda owner in Latin America and he has like a lot of tenant farmers, if you decide to break up that estate, it's basically, basically nobody is going to benefit by not giving that those pieces of property to the people who've been farming them, because like the other person who's in the adjoining plot who could take them over isn't going to benefit nearly as much as the person who already knows that land. So they're pretty close to non-rival to give it to everyone. But of course, if there's someone who's politically unpopular, you can obviously exclude them from the benefits of the land reform. Right? Yeah.
I have a question. So, for instance, in Europe with the social health care,
Yeah.
would it be congestible? In one of the states would be more of a political because it's not excludable, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that healthcare is pretty much a private good. In other words, it's both rival. It's like if you use a doctor, then he has less time for me, and it's excludable because you can easily keep someone out of the system. So I think healthcare is pretty much a private good. But it might have some public good aspects because I don't want to see starving people or people dying on the streets, right? So in that sense, it might have some of a public good aspect. But just the direct health benefits are mostly a private good, I think. Michael, do you have a question?
I'm having a little trouble,
Yep.
I guess, separating rival and excludable.
Yeah.
If something is like a congestible good, doesn't that automatically, like, for example, if your park is congested, doesn't that take the benefit away from, like, people who want to go into the park?
It does, but the point is, if you can't keep people from going into the park, then even though it sucks that there's a lot of people in the park, still it's going to be very hard to keep people from making the park suck by having so many people going to it. And that's true with roads too. Like roads, even though they get congested, it's like proved really, really hard to keep them from getting congested by charging people to go on to them. You know what I mean? So congestible has to do with control over entry without causing the problems of congestion. You know what I mean? And excludable has to do, and rival has to do with how bad things get if a lot of people are on there, regardless of whether you can keep people off or not. You know what I mean? These are only public goods, but at least as important is what I would call public bads, which at some points in these slides, because of my crappy spell checker, got replaced by public bars, and that definitely is not what I was meaning to refer to. Though those could be viewed as public goods, possibly excludable and rival though. But anyway, so public bads are things that bring diffuse harms rather than benefits. So one example of that is land takings, right? So imagine that we want to build like a military base to bring a public good, right? That will often bring a public bad to all the people whose land needs to be taken to build that base, right? And why is it a public bad? Well, because there's usually hundreds of people whose land has to be taken away. So it's not just one person who's being affected, but if it's going to be done, all of those people are going to be affected, right? And so a lot of land assembly is actually a huge issue in many countries. For example, in Colombia right now, they're trying to build infrastructure and they don't have a system of eminent domain where they can take land. And it's very, very hard for them because basically that ends up meaning that they have to pay enormous prices in order to purchase the land that they need to build roads and bridges and things like that. Corporate acquisitions are another example of that, right? If someone wants to buy a company, they want to buy all the shares of the company, right? And that's going to hurt, or it's going to cost something to all the people who currently own the shares of the company. And it's not possible for one of those people to just give up their shares. They all have to do it at the same time. So the harms that brings are sort of non-rival and non-excludable, right? That they accrue to a lot of different people at the same time. Debt settlements are another example of that. So this has been a huge issue in the foreclosure crisis, right? There were tons of people who owned parts of all these people's homes. and it was almost impossible to get them all together to agree on a settlement to redo the mortgage because they were all split all over the country, and each wanted to demand a big chunk of the benefits associated with that resettlement. Another example is the FCC auctioned off the telecommunications spectrum during the 1990s and is now trying to reassemble chunks of it in order to put in WiMAX, which will blanket the country in Wi-Fi. So in order to reassemble the spectrum, the FCC needs to purchase back big contiguous blocks of spectrum. And that requires diffuse harms to all the people who currently own that spectrum, usually television stations. So yeah, Edward.
So like I was like kind of reading about that.
Yeah.
Before they were trying to buy it back and they were auctioning it, and I remember reading that it was like very profitable.
Yeah.
To like auction off the spectrum. Like, so is the government going to be spending like more money? Like, how much money are they spending relative to like, how much they gain from their sold?
Well, so I think the government is going to have to, in the cases where they're going to end up spending a lot of money, use some coercion. So I don't think they're going to end up spending that much money in the end. Yeah. Go ahead, Bill.
So is that why, because for me it seems like if the government was just buying back the spectrum, then the people that were selling it back to them would be getting like a fair market price for it, so I don't understand why that would be bad. So.
Well, the problem is that every individual person, I mean, if I have to get together all 10 of these people to agree to sell their stuff back, then each one is going to say, oh, well, why don't you just give me a bit extra? And the other one will say, why don't you just give me a bit extra? And because you know, if you don't get my part, the whole thing won't go through, right? And so each of them is going to hold out for a bunch of it.
Okay, so is that how it works then? They're all necessary for the spectrum?
Yeah, that's the point. That's the problem, is that they're all perfectly complementary, right? So they're all going to demand a higher price, right? Patent pool assembly suffers from this problem as well, right? So to get rid of the multi-marginalization problem that we were talking about, one thing you might do is take a bunch of patent holders and merge them all together. But when you try to do that, each one says, oh, but why don't you pay me a lot for my company? Why don't you pay me a lot for my company? Otherwise, I'll go outside and I'll demand a lot for my patent, right? And that can ruin that process as well. Polluting projects are another issue of this, right? If you're going to build a factory and that's going to pollute a whole area, if the people all have the right to say, no, I don't want, you know, this pollution coming in, that's going to be really, really hard to institute. So that's another public bad. So these are not really any different from, yeah, go ahead.
Does rivalry and excludability also apply to public bads, like Republicans?
Yeah, exactly. So non-rivalry is the fact that it applies sort of indiscriminately across a broad range of people. Non-excludability doesn't apply as much because it's sort of like, I guess someone could pay to opt out of the bad, potentially, and we don't have that here. But the key idea in a public bad is it just sort of applies indiscriminately across a broad group of people, and you can't avoid it applying to all those people and make it apply to less of them.
Does the marginal harm to the marginal person differ as you increase the range, or is it the same for everyone?
No, I mean, I think that the idea is that there's some fixed harm that accrues to everyone that's unavoidable as a result of whatever is done. So, again, the collective action problem applies, but now it's what's called the holdout problem, which is that everyone is going to demand these bigger payments in order to accept, you know, the public bad occurring. And that's going to make it impossible to impose that, right? Okay, so these problems are pretty pervasive, and let's think about how we might be able to solve them. So I'm going to try to argue that we're usually going to need coercion, but before that I want to consider some potential private solutions, including what Ben just was saying earlier, which is that some people just contribute to charity, even though it doesn't seem to be particularly in their interest to do it. People often do public-spirited things. Giving to charity, voting, doesn't seem to really make sense for any individual person because the chance that you actually make a difference is very small. Volunteering for military service is another example. And so people are choosing to do these things. They're not acting out of sort of classic self-interest. And we sort of looked at this in problem set 3. They're sort of motivated in these cases by prestige. So like looking good to other people, or maybe looking good to future mates, right? They think if you give to charity, you're a good person and you'll be nice to them as well as nice to charity. It may just make you feel good about yourself. This is called the warm glow hypothesis, regardless of the effect that it has. It might be signaling, so it might help you with your career to show that you're a good person. So a classic example of this is people who are applying to medical school often go and like work in hospitals for the summer because the medical school applications always look favorably on that type of thing, right? Yeah, David.
Do some economists consider this part of the self-interested model, just because you get assigned a utility to these activities?
Yeah, everything. All this stuff is. I mean, everything in this class is just transforming things into some form of self-interest, right? Yeah, Ben.
But I mean, the government does, like, in some sense, subsidize all this. Besides voting, like charity, like you get tax break. Volunteer in the military, you get like the GI.
Still, it's not enough to make people want to do them. And I mean, no matter how much it's subsidized, it's not subsidized enough to make up for it. Like charitable contributions. Yeah, maybe I get 30% discount on that, but I could still, I'm still the social value is much more than 10/7. So there's still the public goods problem. So there's no question that all these things help and that they're important social tools. But first of all, they require a very slow development of culture in order to reward people for doing these types of things, right? In order for something to become prestigious, that's something that takes 50, 100, maybe 1,000 years to develop a good social reward for this. So for many of the biggest social problems that we face, the idea that they're going to be solved using this type of an approach seems implausible. Like in eminent domain, it seems unlikely that you're going to develop a deep-seated cultural value that I should be willing to sacrifice my property in order to, do the thing that's in the social interest. Maybe over hundreds of years you could develop that, but it seems unlikely that it's going to work in any short period of time. And I think the Soviet Union found that trying to instill a cultural value of sacrifice in every area of economic life didn't work terribly well, right? So if goods or bads are local and it's easy for people to move, then people can just move to the place that provides the good the best. And this is called Teague competition. So local areas compete in the provision to try to attract people. This is important for a lot of local public services like street cleaning, schools, police, fire, etc. But it crucially depends on people being able to move, right? People have to be able to very cheaply move to the best area, and the value of the good has to not depend on what location it's provided in. So for example, if California has does a really bad job providing public pools, moving to Minnesota in order to get better provision of public pools is not going to work very well because it's freezing cold in Minnesota most of the time. And so it doesn't really matter that they do a good job providing pools because no one's going to want to swim in them, right? This makes the problem with this is that once you can have a local area that you can keep people out of, say if they don't pay property taxes, and which only accrue to people who choose to move there, basically you've got something that's excludable and rival. Effectively, right? So there's only so many people that can live in a given area. There's so many people who can go to a given school. So while to some extent these might be public goods, in some sense they're really not. They're not really applying over a broad group of people that is sort of fixed, independent of the actions that people take. And so really taboo competition is just pointing out that in some cases something that might initially appear to be a public good is more of a private good. It's not really solving the public good problem. The most famous solution to the public good problem comes from two Swedish guys named Lindahl and Wicksell. So from now on in the lecture, I'm going to focus on the case where the public good that we're thinking of is just a binary thing. So it's not like how much we're going to provide to charity, but just whether we're going to build something that everyone's going to benefit or be harmed by. And this is simpler, and everything that I'm going to say extends to the other case, but I'm just going to focus on this for now. So imagine that each citizen gets some value VI from us building the bridge or school or coming up with the idea, and that the cost of undertaking it is capital C, right? So then a simple solution is you could ask each individual to pay a share of the total cost, which is equal to their share of the total value, right? So if we let SI be VI over capital V, then we can ask each individual to pay SI of the total cost, right? Now, it would be efficient to create this thing if V was greater than C, right? The capital V was greater than C. And everyone will agree if you just ask them whether they're willing to give their share, as long as they know that the good won't be built if they don't make their contribution, right? Because if capital V is greater than capital C, then little vi will always be greater than little vi over v times c, right? So if we assign everyone their share, which is equal to their share of the total value, and then just ask them to voluntarily give the contribution and say that if everyone doesn't contribute, then we're just not going to build the thing, right? Then everyone will choose to contribute. So why not just say, if everyone agrees, we build the project and you pay your share, and if anyone disagrees, we refund everyone their money and we don't build the project, right? And this strategy would work exactly when it's efficient, because everyone is pivotal in the decision, right? Everyone, if they fail to make their full contribution, ruins the whole thing, and is therefore doesn't want to refuse to make their contribution, right? This is called Lindahl pricing or Lindahl equilibrium, and the procedure for putting it into place is called Wickselian unanimity. But there's a question of whether any procedure like this could really work in practice. Yeah, Ben?
Doesn't the magnitude of V greater than C really matter? Because, how much V is greater than C? Because, let's say, the last S, N, the last person doesn't want to pay, for whatever reason.
Yeah.
So then it still might make sense for, all people, S to, N minus the last guy to pay, a little bit more, right? Because the benefit will be better. You want to look at the margins and see, if the one person doesn't pay, it still might make sense.
Well, so I agree that there could be potential problems in implementing this, but imagine you could really commit to this scheme, where you say, look, we're not going to put this into place no matter what, even if it would be efficient, unless everyone agrees to make their contributions. If that's truly what everyone believes is going to happen, then everyone's going to agree to give their contribution. You know what I mean? I'm not saying this is the best thing to do. I'm just saying it would work.
Because people also need to be able to self-realize the V for themselves, their own VI.
That's true. And also, to determine the shares, society needs to be able to figure that out, right? So we'll talk about that now. So in practice, I don't think that this would actually, yeah, Bill.
What if someone obtains no benefit from the thing and maybe obtains benefit from people not having the thing, and they just decide to
Well, then their SI would be negative. If you truly knew the value, if they had negative value.
But then we know their individual value.
Yeah, so that's what's required for this thing, right? Each person has this value, and we can assign them a share of the total, which is equal to their individual value.
So everyone's not paying the same thing.
No, everyone has to pay their share of the total value.
I thought it was the whole thing.
No, we know everyone's value. We make them each pay their share of the total value of the cost. David.
It seems like people just lie about their
Well, David, that's you're up next. Yeah. So why do you think this wouldn't work?
Well, I guess for a couple of reasons. One is that it'd be pretty hard to estimate people's individual values accurately, and you'd have an incentive to mislead.
Yeah.
And then the other is that it would be a major problem if you were really, really close to getting the project actually completed, but one person was just not cooperating.
Yes. And so the second thing you said was that it might not be credible, and which was sort of what Ben was getting at too. It's if 99 people agree and they're all really enthusiastic, and then one person says no, it's not very credible that you're really just going to be nope, it's off, right? You're probably going to come up with the extra money. But if you do that, then everyone's going to have an incentive to be the one who lies and Yeah, David?
I was just say, couldn't you for as far as determining V, couldn't you use the same method as we did in price discrimination? It's like, let's say you're building a park, you
Yeah.
look for like different characteristics that like would attribute to V. So like, let's say
Yeah.
you charge a family more if by their proximity to the park and like the number of kids they have.
That's a great point, but the problem is, oh, sorry, you're saying if you know things about the people.
Yeah, so you assign a V according to like.
Yeah. Well, so that's exactly the idea of like why we might be able to know the VIs, right? But so that's exactly the sort of strategy we'd use potentially to know the VIs. But the problem is that it's pretty darn hard to get exact knowledge of every person's VI, right? I mean, I agree. What you're saying could help you get some sense for it, but there's still going to be some uncertainty. It's just too hard to know that precisely exactly everyone's willingness to pay, right? And the thing is, people will only agree if VI is greater than SIC. But if SI is only an approximation of VI over V, this is really dangerous, right? Because there could be just somebody who you misestimated by a little bit who says no, and then you scupper the whole project because of that one person, right? So even if we choose, even if C is so much smaller than the V's, and this is a very small probability event, that we end up with someone who genuinely doesn't want to go through with it just because we assigned him the wrong share, right? We just assigned him too high of a share and he like genuinely doesn't support the project at that share. Even if that's a really low probability event, there are so many people that the chance that somebody ends up being like that is actually pretty high, right? So this is why it's really hard to imagine actually putting into practice this sort of unanimity thing, is that it relies so fragilely on exactly knowing everyone's value, because even if there's a slight chance you got it wrong, over a large number of people, that's going to compound, right? We can study this formally by crunching the numbers. So let's imagine that the CDF, the cumulative distribution function of VI, is f of VI, and that everyone has equal shares, right? Identically and independently distributed. That means everyone is drawn from this distribution f, right? Then the probability that any given individual rejects the offer is the probability that their value is below their share of the cost, right? C over n, right? And so therefore the probability that any individual consents to the offer is 1 minus f of C over n, right? And so the probability that everyone consents is 1 minus f of C over n to the n, right? Because we only get it if every person consents, and they're all drawn independently. So imagine that we are able to get the probability that somebody rejects down to 1 part in 1,000, right? That sounds like we really have an incredibly good estimate of people's values. So, but even with that, once we have 1,000 people in the population, which is smaller than the population of the smallest town, right? You know, a small town, that's 35. That's only going to give you a 35% of chance of success if you crunch these numbers, right? And if you have 10,000, which is still a pretty darn small town, you're down to a 1 in 20,000 chance of success, right? So even if you have an incredibly precise estimate of people's values, if there's a large number of people, you're like totally screwed. There's just no chance that this system can work, right? And you can't solve this problem by adjusting shares. In fact, you can prove that the optimal thing to do here is just, if everyone's IID, to offer the same share to everybody. If people are not IID, you use a market power type thing where you divide the shares in proportion to the elasticity of everybody's willingness to accept. And this is not just true of this particular unanimity scheme that I described to you, But in fact, any scheme you can potentially use runs into exactly this problem. So if you try to have people say, oh, what's my value, then they're all going to claim it's really big. If you say, no, we're just going to say, here's a take it or leave it offer, well, then there's always going to be some probability, some small probability that you misestimated and somebody ruins the whole thing. No matter what scheme you use, you always run into this problem. And so basically, what we get is that we're damned if we do ask people what their values are, and we're damned if you don't and try to make people these take it or leave it offers. And this is the basis of a very fundamental theorem which really just extends this collective action problem we talked about, which is called the Maylaf and Postlethwaite theorem. So what this states is that if everyone must consent to their funding the project and no external funds are available, the probability that the project is undertaken goes to zero as the number of people gets large under any mechanism you can possibly use. So what this says is there's no voluntary, something in which everyone has to agree, and self-financing system that can ever work. Okay. So that means that we always are going to run into the collective action problem that we described here. There's no way around it. Public projects, either goods or bads, will always require coercion. And this is true in the binary case that we considered, but also more broadly. And coercion can basically operate in two different ways that solve one of the two problems, the concept of being voluntary or self-financing. And in some ways, these are very similar. So, Temis, what are two ways you can imagine the government using coercion to solve this problem?
I guess provide a subsidy.
Yeah, and they'd have to coerce people to raise the money for that subsidy, right? And what's the other way you can imagine them doing it?
Direct regulation?
Well, they could just directly force the people to pay, right?
Yeah.
They could. So all the people who were trying to get consent to contribute, we could just force them to contribute rather than allowing them to consent.
Like
right?
a lump sum.
Yeah. So, in other words, both of those are exactly the same thing. It's just an issue of whether the people who are going to benefit are the ones who are coerced or whether some other people are the ones who are coerced, right? So the government can either get rid of consent and just force people in the community to contribute, right? Or it can raise some money from the outside. But how does it do that? Well, it has to raise taxes on somebody else, right? And that's also coercive, right? So that basically means that both strategies require some sort of coercive government taxation in order to achieve it. Now, on the side of public bads, in practice, the government uses a particular approach. And Ben, what does the government? Don't look at your screen. What does the government do in practice when there's a public bad in order to solve the pullback problem? We were talking about this just a few minutes ago.
They forcibly, like in the South America example,
Yep.
they would forcibly take the land away from the people.
Yeah, and what's that called in the United States?
Eminent domain.
Yeah, that's eminent domain, right? So that's what they do on the public bad side. On the public good side, what they usually do is have taxes fund public goods. So local communities raise property taxes to fund parks and schools. Cities raise general revenues for many services. Much of national government spending is financed by taxes on local spending is based on taxes on the people who actually are going to use the service. And in the case of public bads, they use eminent domain. So the government can just take the land from people, impose this cost on them, and they're required to give some sort of just compensation by the Constitution, but this is typically based on like the so-called fair market value of the land, which is usually well below what people actually value their own land they've been living on for a long time at, right? And this is the reason why it caused so much outrage. And the use of this type of system has been greatly expanded in recent years by Supreme Court decisions, which basically said that they could do this not just if they were going to build like a bridge or a road, but like even if they wanted to build like a shopping mall or an industrial complex or something like that. So similar things to this happen for corporate debt or corporate acquisitions. So in most countries, you're not allowed to hold on to your share of a company if someone else wants to acquire the company. There's a vote that happens, and then you're forced to sell your share at whatever price the other people agree to, right? Similarly, in debt, to try to deal with these foreclosure issues, the government started instituting rules that if 60% of people agreed to a change in the terms of the loans, all the other people who own parts of the loans were forced to go along with that, even if they disagreed. And the government can also use coercive tax revenues from the outside. So sometimes this is used for eminent domain situations. Even though you might use eminent domain to make sure there's no holdout, you also might, tax a bunch of other people and use that money to subsidize the people to try to get them not to feel so bad about getting their land taken. Okay. Yeah, Terrence.
So for the FCC spectrum, is there an eminent domain over the spectrum?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So I don't think we really know, but given that the FCC invented the property rights over the spectrum, they're not like really constitutional property rights. The FCC, they're more like regulatory things. I guess what the FCC granted, the FCC can taketh away. Yeah. The FCC giveth and the FCC taketh away. A key question then is if we're going to have to use coercion and government power, we have to have some way, rather than just having everyone agree like we do in markets or using a competitive system, to determine when we're going to invoke the government power in order to do this. Because clearly, for every crappy shopping mall, it's not worth taking away people's land. But on the other hand, there are some projects that are so important that, they really need to get done, and the whole point of having eminent domain is to let them get done, right? So how are we going to make collective decisions about this? When is it worth building a project, right? Well, the basic analysis here is very similar to our discussion of how you can determine what the size of an externality is, right? And David, could you remind us of what were sort of the three ways that we thought of dealing with thinking about externalities?
Yeah, I guess just trying to determine like the marginal benefit or the marginal cost that is present, and then charge a tax or a subsidy equal to that to kind of cancel.
So that was way number one. That was sort of like the scientific cost-benefit analysis type way. And then there were two other approaches we discussed as well.
Just as far as like determining how to eliminate the externality, or to
No, like what the size of the externality was, right? Remember in that lecture, one way was the scientific way, and then there were two other approaches we talked about.
Just comparing like, I know like comparing what would happen if the person that committed that externality wasn't present, and then kind of comparing.
Yeah, so the VCG mechanism was one approach, right? The Vickery-Clark-Groves mechanism. We asked everyone to report their value, and then we made them pay their externality on everybody else. So that's one approach. And then there was a third one that we sort of made fun of.
It was just the reported value method?
Yeah, the contingent valuation, the survey method, right? Yeah. So those were the three approaches we talked about. So assessment by experts, ineffective surveys, or using some fancy mechanism like VCG, right? And basically these three methods are used with declining frequency. So probably the most common thing to make a public decision is assessing by experts. Then using ineffective surveys probably plays a little bit of role, and I don't think anyone's ever used a VCG to do any significant public decision. there is sort of a key difference in this situation compared to the externalities, which is that the decision in many of these cases is quite simple. So compared to the externality thing where you have to figure out exactly how much of the externality, here it's usually a decision like, do we build this thing or not? So that simplifies things significantly. Second, often for public goods, in some sense almost what we mean by public goods, as I said before, is that individuals have significant information about whether this is the right thing to do or not. So think about the example of eminent domain, right? You, as someone who's a property owner, know a lot about how willing you are to move. And it's really important that as we make our decision about whether to build the mall or not, we get input from you about how costly it is for you to move, right? And there's a very large number of individuals involved. So in these settings, what we often do is none of these three things. What we often do is voting to decide what we're going to do. So everyone receives some weight. So what do I mean by voting? So the simplest form of voting, right, is just that everybody gets a single vote and the majority rules. But more broadly, we can give different weights to different people, right? And then if the sum over all the people who are in favor of their weights is above some threshold, we can approve or not. So that threshold might be 2/3, like in the Senate, right, for many things. Or it could be lower. It could be 30% of people need to approve. And I could give more weight to people who own more shares in a corporation, right? But that's sort of the general idea of voting, right? So let's think about how voting is as a way to make a social decision. So again, let's suppose that everyone has the same share and the same number of votes, and that we have IID valuations, right? So ideally what we'd like is that if the sum of everyone's values is greater than the cost, that we'd like to build the project, right? Another way of putting that is that the average value that people have is greater than their share of the cost, C over N, right? So when does this pass under voting? Well, under voting, it will pass if a majority of people, or a plurality, if we're not going to, it could be 2/3, it could be 1/3, it could be whatever, but some threshold up in favor of it, right? But notice that this is not determined by whether the average person values it more, but rather by whether the median person or the X quantile person values it more, right? So it'll get a majority of votes if at least half of the people have values that are above their cost, rather than if the average person has the value above the cost, right? And so that means that in order to design the right voting rule, you need to know what quantile of the distribution corresponds to the mean of the distribution, right? And that can often be hard for the government to know. Perhaps we can guess. And this is sort of the principle on the basis of which we should set different thresholds in different voting situations, right? The reason why we set the threshold higher for things like constitutional amendments, I would guess, is that we think that the median may be well above the mean for constitutional changes. So we think that there may be like a big left tail of the distribution. Some people are really harmed by changes to the Constitution, right? And so we want to reduce the chances of that happening unless we're in a state of the world where the distribution is really high. Why does voting fail to give us, the efficient outcome? Well, basically the problem is people in voting can say, yes, I approve, or no, I don't approve, but they can't really show how much they care, right? If people could say, no, not only am I in favor of this, but I'm really in favor of this, or no, I'm not just opposed to this, but I think this is just horrible, right? then we could take into account quantitatively how much people care. But because we can't do that, the voting rule is based on this median thing rather than on the mean, which we want it to be based on. Yeah, Terrence.
But it was quantitative, would it run into the same problems as
It would, yeah, exactly. So that's the problem. So because of these problems, we can't put in the quantitative information. We're forced to use only this ordinal information, but what we really care about is the cardinal information. And this problem gets much worse when we move beyond deciding between two things and have to choose among many. Because when we're just deciding among two things, well, then at least maybe the median is somewhere near the mean. But if we're deciding among many, we're like trying to figure out how to rank all these different things, right? And yet all we know is sort of how people, what order people put in them, and that's like not very useful information. So let me give you an example of that. So imagine that we're voting on three candidates, A, B, and C, right? And imagine that 1/3 of people rank A, then B, then C. 1/3 of people rank B, then C, then A. And then the other third of people rank C, then A, then B. So who should win in this case? Well, one way that you can think about it is looking at the pairwise majority winners. That is, imagine that there any pair of candidates ran against one another. Who would win? And Shin? Who would win if A ran against B in this case? And we did a majority vote.
Then A would win, because
Yeah.
in the first and third vote, A is ahead of B.
Exactly. B would win 1 vote, A would win 2 votes. Now, if B ran against C, who would win?
B would win because B is ahead in the first 2 votes.
Great. And what if C and A ran against each other? Who would win?
C would win because C is ahead in the last votes.
That's a little bit of a problem, isn't it? So A beats B beats C, but then C beats A, right? So who should win? And the answer is, there's really no answer. I mean, there's just, all these guys are equally good in some sense, right? So this is called Condorcet's paradox. And it implies that any system for deciding in this case is going to be pretty arbitrary. So to make that a little bit more formal, imagine that we want a system to satisfy some basic properties. First of all, imagine that everyone prefers A over B, then we think society should prefer A over B. Right? Second of all, we want to say that adding an extra option C to the system doesn't change the ranking that we put of A over B. If A was beating B, adding C doesn't change anything. And third, the system should work for any set of rankings that people submit. So these sound like really reasonable conditions, right? But it turns out that Arrow in 1951 showed a very powerful result, depressing result, based on these conditions, which is that the only ranking system satisfying these properties makes one citizen a dictator over all the other citizens. That is, the only system that you can do if there are at least 3 people and at least 3 options is one that makes one person preferences determine everything. Okay, so what this leads us to is that we have to trade off a range of evils in making social decisions, right? So one tool we can use is expert analysis. And Bill, what are some of the pros and cons of that?
Well, the pros obviously is that you have people that know a lot about the area that you're talking about. The cons are that the decision is made by a small group of people, so maybe, although they were trying to take into account the whole thing. I don't know what the comment would be.
Yeah, well, so I mean, I think the benefits are that it allows expertise, it allows people to think really carefully and soberly about the issue, and often the experts have the right incentives.
Actually, maybe a con would be, like in the Friedman example, if there's like an incentive problem, like the experts making the decision have some incentive to like make a decision that's better for them and not for the...
So that's one real possibility, but, and that's really important. I think also at least as important is that if we're trying to decide about whether to build, you know, the factory or the bridge or whatever, it's really hard for an expert to know how much you value your land, right? And it's also really hard for an expert to know how much you value having a new bridge that can let you get to your work more quickly. Because you might just value that in some very particular way, or you might value the view that you get from the bridge in some very particular way of your own, right? And so it's going to leave out any information that is individual, that comes from individual people, right? So that's the major con, as well as the problem that the experts might manipulate things. Second option is the Vickrey-Clark-Rose mechanism. And Mike, what are the pros and cons of the Vickrey-Clark-Rose mechanism?
So like an efficient outcome.
Yeah?
Because the people respond to the value that they have, but at the same time you can have collusion and problems with people grouping together.
Yeah, absolutely. So the benefit is that it efficiently incorporates everyone's information. That's good. But the problem is that it's totally impractical. It requires you burn all the money that's collected from the system, and it is really vulnerable to collusion. So in practice, it's never going to work. So that sucks. How about voting? Emily, what did we just say were the pros and cons of voting?
Voting doesn't give us kind of more information.
Yeah. But what's the benefit of it?
The benefit is that it's a lot easier to do and people are less likely to lie. Well, actually, yeah, they can still lie if you use certain voting systems.
Yeah. But it gives us a way to incorporate people's information, the subjective information they have, without running into all the messy problems of VCG. Maybe the only way to do that. But it has at best a weak relationship to efficiency because it doesn't give us cardinal information. Yeah, Luke.
Does voting lend itself to factions and like special interest groups that could harm the general public?
I mean, I think it depends. I think the more people you require to vote, like the higher threshold you have, the less that happens. But on the higher threshold you have, the more you run into the unanimity problem. So it has sort of trade-offs, but yeah, that's right. So I think that in practice, what we really do in our society, or what seems optimal, is to combine systems 1 and 3. System 2 seems very impractical. Systems 1 and 3 both have problems, but probably work best if combined. And what sort of system of Teague? What sort of system of government do you think combines expertise and deliberation with voting?
Well, in practice, none of them really, but I guess in theory, representative.
Yeah, I mean, sort of the idea of representative democracy, right, is that you have people giving their input in terms of the things where it really depends on their individual preferences, and at sort of a broad level, right, on simple issues, the areas where voting is the strongest. And then you have a bunch of experts who they've sort of selected make a lot of decisions about more detailed things, and so forth. Yeah, Ben?
That just reminds me of like kind of like Iran's government, where like you have like the council of, I forget what it's called, but they like approve like a slate of people to vote for. So you have the experts giving people the options, and then the people choose the options.
Well, I mean, I think every system has some, every representative system has some like that. I think people would argue that it's better if it's the other way around, if the experts are chosen by the voting or something.
That kind of like discredits their expertise, right? Like, what's the point of having an expert? Like who determines the expert, right? If people are doing it, they're not really experts. Like is a senator really an expert on anything?
Well, that to some extent that's true. unfortunately, but at least the principle behind representative democracy. I guess what I'm trying to say is that, in some sense, what we've done is given sort of an economic account of like why you would think about, you know, representative democracy, even with all of its flaws, as potentially.
I just feel like we could do better if we really wanted to do expertise plus voting. Like, I think you could, I don't know what it is, but I feel like somehow restricting like your options.
So here are some ways that I've been working on that you might be able to do a little bit better on some of these things. So one thing is, can we use money in a more intelligent way than VCG does? Well, VCG is a total mess, but imagine we do want to incorporate some cardinality. Now, what if we tried to do something that was more like the first price auction, or like an expected externality mechanism that we talked about before, which isn't so sensitive to collusion and doesn't require burning the money? So one idea is, imagine people could buy votes. So you go into the ballot box, and you say, I want to have 10 votes. And you have to write a check for $10 at that point, right? Well, then people who really cared would buy a lot of votes. People who didn't care wouldn't buy so many votes, right? Now, in particular, imagine that the first vote cost you $1, the second vote cost you $2, the third vote cost you $3, and so forth. The reason why that would be a useful system is it's going to mimic the expected externality mechanism, because think about it. If I've already bought 2 votes, that additional vote I get causes me to win marginally in exactly the case when there are 3 votes in the opposite direction, right? And so that's a case where sort of society values things 3 units in the opposite direction. So to win that chance, I should have to pay $3, because that's sort of the size of the externality that I'm imposing, right? And this system doesn't run into the problems that VCG has. So this is something that I'm working on. Not necessarily saying this should be used in real elections, because people don't want the rich to be able to buy more things, but something like eminent domain or some other decisions like that, it might be a reasonable, or corporate acquisitions, it might be a reasonable system. In elections, if we don't want to use money, how might we be able to get some of this cardinality? Well, one thing we could do is we could allow people to store their votes across elections. So imagine that there's state elections, local elections, national elections. Imagine you get each year 100 votes, and you can allocate them across different issues and whatever as you wish, right? That's going to force you to make trade-offs over things that you care a lot about and things you care less about. And that will allow for some of this cardinality. And in fact, what if you could store them across elections? So you're born with 1 million votes, and you can use them across your lifetime as you wish. Then, without having any money, we can still get basically cardinality. And in fact, if you combine these two systems by having the influence you have on any given issue be quadratic in the number of votes you have to spend, and then you can have both this and this system put together. Okay, so let me just wrap up the term. So this term we explored some of that, what I think are sort of the most basic trade-offs in the economic organization of a society. And my hope is that this led you to a better, more nuanced, and less ideological understanding of the trade-offs that our society faces when we choose different institutions. And in particular, I hope I gave you a way of sort of disaggregating rather than there just being capitalism or socialism. I hope this class helped you see both very particular institutions which constitute a capitalist society and institutions which constitute more of a socialistic society, and help give you a sense of how to quantify what the trade-offs are between those different types of institutions, rather than just seeing them as some ideological package of things that you're in favor of or against. And so let me just quickly review what I think are sort of like the core trade-offs between more capitalist-type institutions and more socialist institutions, and how we thought about the trade-offs between them. So one trade-off has to do with internalizing externalities and providing public goods and bads, right? And the trade-off there was basically the distortions from ignoring information that individuals have, right? versus the flaws of any system that tries to extract that information from individuals. So we can have sort of an unregulated market system that's totally non-political, but then we're going to have all these distortions from externalities. Or we can try to get the information we need, but that requires either having these technical experts who are flawed, having a voting system which is flawed, or using the VCG system which is a total disaster, right? So that was the trade-off between a centralized and a decentralized system along that dimension. We had a trade-off in terms of redistributing income and providing social insurance. So on the one hand, if we provide lots of social insurance and redistribute lots of income, that helps deal with people's risks. But on the other hand, it provides a disincentive for people to earn more income, right? And that was the basic trade-off between socialism and capitalism. We talked about regulation or providing prizes versus allowing firms to exercise their market power. And there we traded off the static dead weight loss caused by monopoly versus incentives for entrepreneurship, creative destruction, and innovation, and cost reductions by firms. That's another basic trade-off between a regulated, more socialistic system and a more capitalist system. And we talked about the trade-off between competition policy against cartels and mergers versus the economies of scale that those mergers allow. And that's another trade-off between a very disaggregated competitive system and one that tries to take advantage of the economies of scale, as many more socialistic types of systems did. And the point is, all these trade-offs are pretty darn different from one another. And when you need to quantify them are different. So the truth is, it doesn't make any real sense for someone to be ideologically, in my view, in favor of capitalism or in favor of socialism. The truth is that there's a whole bunch of different things that one has to quantitatively think about and look at to think about all these different dimensions. And I hope that this course led you to a less ideological, more quantitative, and more detail-oriented way of thinking about the trade-offs involved in public policy. And that this will help you to overcome the challenges we saw by combining into one person the role of an expert and a voter, and help improve our world in that way. So, thanks a lot.